Hi all and welcome back to connective tissues, and we still have ST here. ST is napping and hiding from the cello lesson that is happening. So connective tissues are the most diverse, and they're often very difficult for students who are just starting out to distinguish from one another and even remember their names, because it's not something you have likely encountered directly, like explicitly talking about it. But let's look if we can demystify it, and then in class we will keep working on making it easier to identify and remember their functions. In general, connective tissue is tissue that offers structural support, protection, energy storage, fluid transport, immune response. Kind of loosely speaking, it connects different things in the body. But the word connect is used very differently for the different types of connective tissues. And one thing that they do all have in common is they all come from mesenchyme, which is that gelatinous embryonic tissue that comes from mesoderm during very early development. All right, so one common thing is that the cells of connective tissue are found in a matrix that has ground substance and fiber in it. So most connective tissues have this feature where their cells are not touching. So far, you saw epithelial tissue only where all the cells were packed really, really tightly together on every side. In fact, it was a feature of that tissue that the cells were sewn together by tight junctions, creating a really seamless, waterproof barrier. However, in connective tissue, it's almost the opposite. Here you can see in the image, you have a cell and another cell. Here's another cell, and even here, there's a cell. And none of those cells are really closely touching, and there's a bunch of space with this rope-looking stuff in between. Well, that rope-looking stuff of different thicknesses and different patterns are different protein fibers. And we have a blood vessel here. So this tissue never lines a space. It is never immediately next to a hollow area that you would see on a microscope slide. And most types of connective tissue are highly vascular, meaning there are a lot of blood vessels going through the middle of the tissue. If you can remember back to epithelial tissue, even in the cases where you have many, many layers of epithelial tissue, there were no blood vessels going in between those layers. So we would say that epithelial tissue is avascular, no blood vessels in the actual tissue. That is not the case with connective tissue. Most connective tissue is quite vascular. There are some exceptions, and the most obvious exception is cartilage. It is not vascular. It's a diverse group. Okay. So the cells are spread out, generally not touching, and the cells can either be motile or fixed, meaning the cells stay where they are forever and they just do a job locally, or there are cells that can move around from different parts of the tissue. The matrix, or the space in between the cells, is non-living, right? Because what's the smallest unit of life? I hope you're actually answering. The smallest unit of life is a cell. So if this is a space in between cells, meaning it doesn't have any cells, that means it cannot be alive, so it's not living. However, it is constantly modified and maintained by the cells that are in that space, right? That are around the non-living things. So the cells themselves manufacture that matrix, and they kind of spew stuff out, and that stuff sits in between the cells doing its job. Okay. Now, there are different types of cells that are common to connective tissue, and their endings or suffixes can give us some clues about what these cells do. So if the cell name ends in blast, that means that that cell is growing or making something, secreting something. One example is fibroblast, right? Blasting fibers all over the place, meaning it secretes the proteins that create these rope-looking things, those protein fibers. If the end of a cell name is classed, it means that it's actively breaking something down, meaning taking the big structures and deconstructing them into little building blocks, breaking stuff down. For example, osteoclast. Osteo means bone, clast is to eat bone, basically. So it's breaking down bone, so there's no more bone stuff. And the ending site, that cell is doing neither of those things. It's usually a cell that's maintaining something in a different way, and those are generally common cells. Just site means cell. So let's look at some specific cells that we're going to talk about. Fibroblasts are found in pretty much all connective tissue types. They secrete the proteins that are built into fibers in order to create the protein fibers that are in the matrix. Adipocytes, adipose tissue is fat. So these are fat storage cells, and they look like just like bubbles, yellow or white bubbles, and it looks like it's empty space, but it's not. They're just filled with clear fat. Mesenchymal cells, I've heard it pronounced mesenchymal cells, but I'm going to continue saying mesenchymal. Mesenchymal cells are precursor cells. If you remember mesenchyme, it was that gooey substance that is made from mesoderm very early in development. Mesenchyme ends up becoming many kinds of connective tissue cells. And we'll talk more about that as we talk about specific types of connective tissues. And there are lots of different types of immune cells that live in connective tissue. And they can be macrophages, right? Macro means large, phage is to eat. Phagocytosis, right, is to eat into the cell. Mast cells or lymphocytes. Okay. More about those in future. Now that we've looked at the cells, let's look at the types of fibers that are found in between cells. The most common fiber that you're going to see, and it's the most common protein in our bodies, is collagenous fibers, and they're made out of collagen protein. So you have many, many, many copies of this protein called collagen, and then that protein clumps together into kind of rope shape structure, a protein fiber. There are several different types of these proteins, collagen protein, and then there are many ways that the actual proteins connect to one another to create fibers. These are really strong. If you were to compare it to the same diameter of steel, they're significantly stronger than steel. They are flexible, you can bend them, but they are not elastic, so they cannot stretch and recoil. So the amount and the arrangement of these collagenous fibers will give us specific types of properties in the matrix, etc. The collagenous fibers generally look white, and you see them here, okay, as tendons and ligaments. So we have lots and lots and lots of collagenous fibers running parallel to each other, and that's why it looks like white ropes. If you eat meat, you've probably seen chicken breast with like a white rope thing kind of on the edge of it. That would have been many, many collagen fibers bundled together into one rope. Now, other than collagenous fibers, We also, in the matrix of connective tissues, sometimes have reticular fibers. And reticular fibers are really thin. They are also made of collagen protein, but the proteins themselves are arranged in a different three-dimensional organization than collagenous fibers. So they're much, much thinner. They stain differently, so they look different in stained microscopy slides. They're also often coated with glycoproteins, and they generally have a three-dimensional structure of like a sponge-like network, kind of like a net. Think of a net or like a spider web. And these nets or networks hold spleen, lymph nodes, part of basement membrane under epithelia to create for support. And finally, the third type of fiber that is often found in connective tissue matrix is called elastin. And elastin is coiled and it looks wavy when you look under the microscope. And it can be stretched, and then after it's stretched, it can return to its original size without being damaged. So it's not just stretching, it's also recoiling, right? Bringing back to the original shape. And it works with a protein called fibrillin to form sheets or filaments depending on different tissues, okay? So collagenous fibers are really, really strong, really common, are not elastic. Reticular fibers, also made of collagen, but very different 3D structure, and they create these networks or nets. Elastin fibers are wavy, coiled, and they are elastic. All right. So if we take all the cells and kind of combine them with different amounts and different organization of the fibers, and then add ground substance, you can combine them in different ways to have lots of different types of connective tissue. Ground substance is the part of the matrix, right? Part of that space between cells that is not the fibers, but the rest of it. And the rest of it, there's usually water and stuff dissolved in the water. But what it is varies quite a bit, and ground substance can be totally liquid, can be gelatinous, it can be very, very thick gelatinous to the point of it's almost solid, and it can be totally solid. Okay, so the different solids in there are non-fibrous proteins, GAGs, or glycosaminoglycans. They're basically chains of sugar molecules, proteoglycans, glycoproteins, and it can be viscous. Okay. So as a review, in general, connective tissue has cells that are usually not touching one another with lots of space in between cells. That space is filled with fibers or rope-like protein structures, and the three common fibers are collagenous fibers, reticular fibers, and elastin fibers. And then there's something filling up the rest of the space, and it can be watery, it can be gooey, gelatinous, or solid. Let's look at the specific types of connective tissue and their organization. All right, so all of different types of connective tissues come from mesenchyme, which is an embryonic tissue. That mesenchyme differentiates into three types of connective tissue that can be classified based on their function. So connective tissue proper just means it's a category of connective tissues that is kind of like the traditional connecting function. They usually have this kind of structure traditional that we looked at these cartoons in the previous slide. And the connective tissue proper, let's come back to it in a second. The second category is supporting connective tissue, and these are going to be very hard, solid structures. And then there's the fluid connective tissue, which is liquid and just blood and lymph. Yes, blood is a connective tissue and lymph is another fluid, also connective tissue. So let's go back to connective tissue proper. Connective tissue proper can be classified into loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. And those are telling you something about these tissues. So in loose connective tissue, you have a lot of ground substance. That means not a ton of cells and not a ton of fibers, relatively speaking. Lots of ground substance. And there are 3 specific tissue types called areolar, I've heard people say areolar, adipose, and reticular connective tissue. Whereas the whole category of dense connective tissue, it has a lot of fibers in between those cells. They're very obvious when you're looking under the microscope. And the types are regular dense connective tissue, irregular dense connective tissue, and elastic connective tissue. Coming back to supporting connective tissue, it consists of cartilage and bone. Cartilage has a semi-solid matrix, and there are 3 types of cartilage: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. And we have bone. Yes, bone is connective tissue and it has a solid matrix. It's the tissue with the most solid matrix. And there are 2 different subcategories of bone, and that is compact bone and spongy bone. And we have a whole more coming up on that in later chapters and in a later lab. Okay, this chart gives you summary of each connective tissue, their function, or almost each connective tissue, their function, and the key locations that you would find them in the body. Right now, it's not super useful, but you will be able to refer to this later as you study. Okay, so that was our introduction.